welcome to today's episode of the Oyster Stew podcast. I'm Libby Hall, Director of Communications for Oyster Consulting. In this episode, we're focusing on a critical regulatory development that will impact registered investment advisors and exempt reporting advisors, the new AML requirements introduced by the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, or FinCEN. With the January 2026 compliance deadline approaching, RIAs must prepare to implement risk-based AML programs, designate compliance officers, conduct independent testing, and monitor for suspicious activity. But who exactly is impacted? How can firms build an effective AML program? What are the risks of non-compliance? And why do they need to start preparing right now? Today, our experts break down everything RIAs and ERAs need to know, from understanding their obligations to leveraging existing compliance programs and avoiding costly enforcement actions. Whether you're an RIA executive, compliance officer, or risk management professional, this episode will provide key insights to help you stay ahead of the regulatory curve. Let's get started. Ed?
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to our podcast today on AML requirements for registered investment advisors. My name is Ed Wegner, and I am the practice lead for Governance, Risk, and Compliance, or GRC, at Oyster Consulting. And I'm really fortunate to have Bryan Jacobson with me. Bryan's one of our senior level consultants in GRC, and he has extensive experience in broker-dealer and investment advisor compliance, which includes experience with things like AML compliance and more complex areas like digital assets and cryptocurrencies. So we're really fortunate to have Bryan with us today, and welcome, Bryan.
Thanks, Ed. Just a little bit about myself. I've been in the industry for over 25 years, pretty much spent my entire career within compliance, and I've had the fortune of being the CCO for several different firms, including digital asset firms, RIAs, and broker-dealers, clearing firms, and so I've been able to touch a lot of different aspects of the business. One of the areas that I do specialize in is anti-money laundering, so I'm definitely looking forward to this discussion.
And you are ACAM certified, correct?
I am ACAM certified, as well as having spent numerous hours just personally reviewing AML rules and regulations.
Excellent. Well, and it's terrific to have you here as we talk about this topic. And the reason why we're here is because in August of last year, FinCEN, or the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, which is a part of the Treasury, adopted new rules that add certain investment advisors and exempt reporting advisors to the definition of designated financial institution, and for anti-money laundering and counter-financing of terrorism purposes. And so it is going to put requirements onto those types of entities, or at least some of those types of entities, the impacted ones, where they're going to have certain AML requirements, and very similar to what we've seen for broker-dealers. So, Bryan, given that, can you share an overview of what will be required of RIAs and ERAs?
So it's important to understand that there's really 8 key elements of the FinCEN final rule proposal, right? The first, and probably the starting point, is, as you mentioned, Ed, there's a expansion of the definition of a financial institution. Why that's key is that if you look at the previous regulations, RIAs were specifically excluded from the definition of a financial institution, which ultimately drives all of the other requirements that we're going to talk about. So by including an RIA in that definition, it does create the need to create everything that we're about to talk about. But beyond that, the other 7 items is implementing a risk-based AML program. That's key because ultimately what firms need to do is understand that an AML program is not a one-size-fits-all. It really comes down to the specific type of business that the RIA is in, their client demographics, all of the various risks, and really tailoring their AML program based on that. There's also a need for an independent testing of the AML program, and that should be done annually. There's a need to designate an AML Compliance Officer, someone that's ultimately responsible for the AML program. You need to provide employee training. You need to monitor and file suspicious activity reports, and also report currency transactions, cash currency transactions. And then the last thing is ensuring that there's trade rule compliance, that you have the ability to review for that level of trade surveillance.
That's a lot of things that firms need to, consider and be ready for. And the time is kind of short. I mean, the rule goes into effect at the beginning of 2026, so January 1st, 2026, which sounds like it's a lot of time because it's a year away. But given all the things that you had mentioned, that's a heavy lift for firms. And so they really need to start thinking about these things now and start planning for these things now, and why we thought it was a good opportunity at the beginning of this year to start talking about what those requirements are. But importantly, not all firms, not all RIAs and ERAs are impacted by this. Well, I think probably most are. There are certain ones that aren't. And so, Bryan, I wonder if you can explain who will be impacted by these requirements.
Yep, absolutely. So first of all, and just to touch on the point that you're making, what I don't want is for firms to think that it's as easy as putting in place some policies and procedures, and therefore, you can wait until whatever the fourth quarter of this year and then do that work. Really, there's a lot that's going to go into creating your policy. So now is the time to start that if you haven't already started. But to answer your question directly, so the rule ultimately applies to any SEC registered investment advisors and exempt reporting advisors. There are some exclusions. For example, mid-size advisors, multi-state advisors, pension consultants, family offices, and state registered advisors are not covered under the rule. Now, that's not to say that individual states, as an example, may not come up with their own AML requirements, but as it relates to this specific rule, they are exempt.
Excellent. And in thinking about the firms that are impacted in this, there are many firms that have expanded to work internationally. There's foreign firms, and where the jurisdictional lines aren't as clear. So for firms that do business internationally, do FinCEN's new requirements impact them the same as they would a firm that's doing business solely domestically?
There is definitely an impact, but it's not quite the same playing field. So for foreign advisors with their principal place of business outside of the U.S., the rule really only applies to the advisory activities that are conducted within the U.S. or involve services that are provided to U.S. persons. So there is a little bit of a different mindset when it comes to these foreign-based RAs.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And thinking about other types of advisors, there are registered investment advisors whose clients may already be subject to AML requirements because they're considered financial institutions. So how does that work, where an RIA's clients may already be subject to the AML requirements?
Yep, great question. So if an RIA's client is a regulated entity, and I'll use whether it's a mutual fund, a RIA, a bank, trust, so on and so forth, ultimately the RIA is exempt from the AML requirements for that client. So you are able to rely on the fact that they are a regulated entity and not have the same level of AML responsibilities.
And presumably, especially with things like a mutual fund where RIAs, there are certain RIAs where their clients are exclusively mutual funds that are already covered. In those cases, based on their business model, they would not be required to comply with the requirements and could, because their clients are already complying.
That's correct, yes.
You mentioned that, and this being an important part of one of the requirements that you had mentioned, is that impacted RIAs and ERAs need to designate a specific AML compliance officer. Having worked with broker-dealers, reviewing the requirements of the new rule, what types of qualifications should firms be looking for or are required of an AML compliance officer?
Yep. So really, I would say that there's two main things that you should look for when determining whether it's an internal person that you're going to promote as AMLCO or if it's an external hire. But the first thing that you need to look at is obviously their familiarity with the type of business that your firm does. So for example, if an AML officer has extensive experience in maybe retail securities, that may be great and they may be knowledgeable about AML in general. But if your firm does business specifically in private funds, and that's the majority of where you spend your time, then perhaps the background does not exactly match. So you definitely want to make sure that the person that is assuming this role has a good level of business knowledge of the type of business that the firm does. And then also you want to look for the other type of qualifications. While it's not mandatory within the rule, certain certifications such as the ACAMS AML specialist designation, definitely highly recommended. There's also several other good ones out there, although ACAMS is probably the most well-known organization, but you want to look for that. And then, just given the high stakes of AML compliance, in that any mistakes, if you will, can certainly result in seven-figure fines, you really want to ensure that the AMLCO does have extensive number of years of experience advising firms on AML policies. And again, each firm needs to set this number, but I always recommend at least 10 years of relevant experience providing this type of advice.
No, that's great. And I think highlighting the fact that, especially with larger financial institutions where there have been AML breakdowns, those fines are very significant. Even with smaller firms, they wouldn't be as significant as they are with the larger firms, but it can have a big impact on the firm. So, having somebody who has that understanding both of the firm's business and the AML requirements is really going to be key. One question that comes up often when we think about this is RIAs often have affiliates that are already subject to AML requirements, for example, broker-dealers, banks, etc. Can an RIA or ERA utilize the AML programs of those types of affiliated entities?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is in keeping with, in general, the AML rules that are affecting organizations such as banks or broker-dealers today. You can definitely rely on the AML program of whether it's the parent entity or an affiliate. However, the one caveat I would mention is that you have to make sure that at a minimum, their program encompasses everything that the FinCEN requirements require you to do, right? So if there's glaring gaps because of different regulatory bodies that entity reports to, then you just need to make sure that you shore that up and have at least as comprehensive a program that address all of the needs. But ultimately, yes, there is certainly a desire not to have to duplicate or replicate resources and efforts, and you can rely on those programs to the extent that they fit within the regulations.
That makes sense. And when thinking about the work that we've done with broker-dealer clients and their AML programs, they often rely to some extent on third parties, for example, their clearing firms. How will RIAs be able to rely on similar third parties? I'm thinking about potentially their custodians. Will they be able to rely on them at least for certain activities?
So the short answer is yes. There is definitely an ability to rely on a third party, including a custodian. However, I'm going to put this in big brackets and quotes and say that you really need to look at your custodial contract. In most contracts, there will be a specific section that talks about the AML requirements and the fact that the custodian will not take responsibility over those requirements, right? So as an example, a custodian may do something like an OFAC check, and they're doing that as it's required for them as a custodian. However, even if they report those results to you, you can't really rely on those results unless it's specifically spelled out in the contract. Other things that you would need to make sure that are done is that obviously the formal agreement that outlines specifically the delegated duties, and then also You need to make sure that there's an annual attestation from the third party that basically says that they will continue to perform these duties and that they meet all the AML obligations. And the last thing is you need to make sure that whichever third party you're relying on, that they are subject to AML requirements under the Bank Secrecy Act and are also regulated by a federal authority. So again, specific to custodians, yes, theoretically you could rely on a custodian, but I think what you'll find is that most custodians will probably not be willing to take on that liability. And in all cases, just remember, you can always delegate the work. You can never really delegate the liability. So if you're relying on a third party, you just need to make sure that you have a lot of confidence in their process and that you've done the due diligence to know that they have a good process, because if they make a mistake, contractually, you might have some ability to go after that third party. But the reality is that any regulatory issues or reputational damage, because it's in the front page of the Wall Street Journal or so on and so forth, that you can't really delegate. So something to keep in mind.
Yeah, and it sounds like that's very similar to other situations where firms delegate certain regulatory requirements where they're allowed to, is that, they can do that. But at the end of the day, they're required to make sure that that's happening and it's being done effectively. And so due diligence on the front end, as well as ongoing due diligence to make sure that those delegated functions are being done and being done effectively, is going to be critical. Because if there is a breakdown, as you had mentioned, the regulators are going to, they'll understand if you've delegated something, but they're going to want to make sure that you were doing that ongoing review, because if you weren't, then it will be difficult not to have that liability attached to some extent to the RIA that's delegated those activities. So really important thing to keep in mind. One of the other important things that you had mentioned that, again, is very similar to other areas is training. And they specifically call out training as being a requirement. What should RIAs and ERAs expect in terms of the training programs and what makes an effective training program?
Yeah, great question. I've reviewed a lot of different firms of different industries, RAs, broker dealers, and reviewing the training documents. One aspect that I think firms tend to not do as good a job in is around, they try to make the training one size fits all. So what I mean by that is they'll come up with a training deck that talks about the 3 stages of money laundering, and then they'll talk about some common red flags, and all of that is great to set kind of the floor level understanding with employees. But then from there, firms really do need to look at first of all, the specific risks facing their business and what type of training do they need to do to educate their employees on those specific risks. Again, using the previous example, I could talk about red flags involving retail securities, but is that really appropriate for a firm that handles mostly private funds? So the point being is that you need to tailor your training to that of the business of the firm. But then more important than that even is also looking at the type of employees that you have and their interactions and their touch points as it relates to AML. So what I mean by that is that the training that you give a front-facing employee that maybe deals with customers or deals with more of the sales aspects of the RA, their training may very well be very different than someone that is more operational and kind of more on the back end of things, because of their visibility into whether it's client communications, whether it's systems that they're using. And so the training really needs to be tailored towards their specific functions so that they're aware of the piece that they play as it relates to AML and safeguarding the firm against violations.
Excellent. Well, another thing, just thinking about those 8 requirements that you had mentioned, an important one is independent testing. I'm curious, what are the testing requirements? And when FinCEN talks about the testing being independent, what does that look like? What does that mean?
Yep, absolutely. So I think the word independent has to come before anything else, right? So at the end of the day, a firm, if they choose to do it internally, the testing really needs to be done by someone that is not directly or indirectly involved in the AML program. So for example, if you're the chief compliance officer for the firm and maybe the AML compliance officer reports to you, well, you would not be able to do the testing because ultimately that's part of your chain of command, if you will. Similar, if you're responsible for onboarding customers or any aspects of the AML program, you would not be considered independent. So it has to be someone outside of those functions. And then once you identify an independent source, then you need to make sure that that person is obviously trained on AML and trained to look for AML violations. So that would be understanding the FinCEN rules, the Bank Secrecy Act, the SEC rules, all of that to make sure that they can do a thorough independent review of the AML program.
All of this kind of goes back to, whether it's policies and procedures or training or testing, that it needs to be risk-based, right? As part of assessing your training, assessing your testing, the types of testing that you do, developing your policies and procedures, risk should be forefront. So how should firms be assessing risk as part of their AML programs? And is assessing risk the same as testing?
Each firm, in order to develop a comprehensive AML program, should absolutely create a risk assessment specific to AML. I mean, there's other uses you can do a risk assessment for, but specific to AML. What's interesting about the risk assessment is that while it's not specifically mentioned in the final rule, the fact remains that most regulators do expect AML programs to have a risk assessment, and they look at that almost as a sign of a mature and comprehensive program that the firm has gone through the process of creating a risk assessment. The risk assessment should not be thought of as a one and done document. It really is a living, breathing, ongoing exercise. And what you're doing is you're basically creating a numeric score, and you're looking at two things, right? You're identifying all of the risks that you can think of that would impact the potential AML program. And so you're looking at things such as client demographics, client background, resources, personnel. You're looking at product and product demographics, all of those things that make up the program. And you're essentially saying, okay, without any controls whatsoever at the firm, what is the relative risk of these various items that I've identified? And you come up with whatever score from 1 to 5. Then on the flip side, you would look at things such as, well, now that I've put together the mitigation of those risks, right? I have a surveillance program, I have, whatever the mitigations are, you then decide, okay, what is the true risk or the true score of that risk based on the mitigation that I have in place. And once you do that, that allows you to really hone in and identify the specific risks that you need to focus on. It'll give you a comprehensive risk score so that you can kind of see whether or not your AML program as a whole is high or low. And then you can also then hone in on the different risks and focus your attention and your resources on areas that perhaps are scoring a little bit higher than you would like, even after the mitigation has been put in place. And that way you can say, well, obviously I need to put in more guardrails or more controls. So by doing that, once you're done with that, then that allows you to really develop your policies and procedures, because you've gone through the exercise of understanding exactly where and how the risks lie out, and you can then create your policies and procedures. You can create your surveillance program. You can determine how many resources you need to dedicate to the AML function, so on and so forth. So I was just going to say, the one thing, some firms do get confused, and I think you alluded to this earlier, but there is a difference between the risk assessment and the independent audit that I mentioned before. When whether it's Oyster or internally, whenever an independent audit is done, we're really looking at it from a period of time, right? We're saying, okay, show me records from Jan 1 to December 31st of this year, and we're going to look at that, and then we're going to look at your policies and procedures to see if there's any obvious gaps in your policies and procedures. But then what we're going to do is, based on that data set, we're going to then test that data against whatever policies and procedures you've laid out. That's the audit portion. The risk assessment is really more of a holistic view of the entire program, and certainly it's more than just a scope and time. It's looking at the entire program at the holistic level.
Right, and it's looking at the business that the firm does, which could be customers, types of products and services that are offered, the jurisdictions in which you act, and then assessing based on all of that, how risky is our program, and that really drives all of these other things, policies, procedures, testing, training, et cetera. And one of the primary things that this all kind of comes down to is the requirement to monitor for and then potentially report where required suspicious activities or filing of SARs. The policies and procedures, having an AML compliance officer, all of that is really focused on making sure firms can assess activity and identify where there might be issues. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the requirement both to monitor for suspicious activities and then, where necessary to file SARs.
Yep, absolutely. So, I think this is one of the areas that is probably going to be the most time consuming for firms as they develop these AML programs, because first of all, in order for you to report on suspicious activity, you need to make sure that you have the tools and the resources to do the monitoring. So that may involve whether it's a proprietary system that you develop or a third-party system. Either way, there's going to be a time element where you need to implement those new systems so that you can then review both client behavior as well as transaction behavior to look for any number of red flags, and those red flags need to be identified by the firm based on the business of the firm and the type of business that the firm does. But ultimately, you need to create that process so that you can surveil the activities of the firm. Then once that's done, as you're starting to receive potential suspicious activity, then you need to make sure that you go into the system and actually do the filing. Ultimately, SARs are required to be filed 30 calendar days after the date that the activity is initially detected. And, there's certain thresholds. And I think, in a future podcast, we'll go much deeper because SAR filings by itself can certainly be a very good in-depth discussion. But just keeping it at a high level, when you're doing these SAR filings, you want to make sure that you're noting, how was the suspicious activity discovered, who discovered the activity, what actually happened, what red flags were noted as part of the review, and certain demographic information such as the client name, address, that sort of thing, account number. And then, of course, one thing to always keep in mind is that SAR filings are always assumed to be confidential. So that's not just confidential from the standpoint of not informing the person whose account you filed the SAR on, but also internally. So unless that AML function reports through that chain of command, you cannot discuss the SAR itself unless there's someone that you had to bring in as part of furthering the investigation. But either way, the SARs are absolutely considered confidential and should not be disclosed outside of the immediate chain of command.
Well, and the whole issue around monitoring for suspicious activities, reporting suspicious activities, it really is one of the primary areas where we've seen firms, as we've been working with broker-dealers in the broker-dealer space, where we've seen firms run into trouble. And when we talked about those really significant enforcement actions that are taken, oftentimes it's related to the monitoring of suspicious activities or the lack of, or the reporting of suspicious activities or the lack of. And it seems like, a good starting point is to really understand what those red flags are. And there are things that you can look to. FINRA, in helping broker-dealers comply with their requirements, has put out lists of types of things that they consider to be suspicious activities. FinCEN has done similar things. I would anticipate in the lead up to this, you might see guidance coming out from the SEC as well. International bodies such as FATF have put out a number of different typologies that are the types of red flags that a firm might see. And so understanding what those red flags are, making sure that you have means to monitor, to look for those types of red flags. And then importantly, where I've seen firms fall down and leading to enforcement actions is making sure that the follow-up to the monitoring, when there are alerts and flags that say, hey, there's some suspicious activity, making sure that that follow-up is thorough and that there's a good decision-making process around whether that's something where a suspicious activity report needs to be filed. That's going to be important. So, as you start to think towards, getting your program ready for next year, that's going to be an important consideration. And there's a lot of vendors that help with their the types of systems that they have for doing that kind of monitoring. You should be thinking about what types of vendors you need to engage to, and potentially if custodians have programs to kind of help. As we talked about earlier, there could be some reliance on some of the tools and resources that they may have. So it sounds like a lot that needs to be done. Again, there's a year before this actually becomes effective, so now's the time to start thinking about this. Bryan, just before we end this, I was wondering if there are other considerations you think that firms should be planning for.
Well, just to talk quickly about the potential liability, right? So you're absolutely right. Now is the time to get these programs up and running, because before you know it, and everyone has so many multiple hats that they wear and all that stuff. So before you know it, it's going to be the fourth quarter, and you're going to have 3 months to try and cram all this in, which is certainly not enough time. So what I would recommend is that firms start with the risk assessment now, if they haven't already started. They should do a comprehensive risk assessment. That probably will take a few months, and then at the end of first quarter, then I would probably start working on the policies and procedures and looking at the resources to bring in and systems that they need to implement. And all of that could easily take the rest of 2025. So definitely now is the time to get going on that. And one thing to keep in mind is that failure to implement solid AML procedures is not going to work for anyone. I mean, if you've paid attention to some of these AML fines, rarely do you see the AML fine that starts with less than 6 figures. And usually that 6 figures starts at like a 500,000 or more. Recently, just as an example, a bank was hit with a $3 billion AML violation, which included obviously a lot of penalties and fines. But that may not be quite the same for yourself, because obviously that's a very large bank. But even on smaller entities, what I see is typically the starting point for regulatory violations is around 400,000 or 500,000. So even at a very small entity, the AML fines are very stiff. Not to mention there's potential jail time and that sort of thing for the AMLCO or other people in that chain of command that exhibited what the regulators would call willful blindness, which is, hey, look, even though you didn't specifically check on that, you probably should have checked on it, and you had all the information to know that there was suspicious activity. So that's what I would recommend. And again, if there's one thing you take away from this podcast, is the fact that now is the time to act. You should not wait. You should definitely look at the stuff immediately.
Those are all really important points. Another thing that I think firms need to be aware of, if you haven't worked in the AML space before, is even though they talk about this in terms of AML, which is anti-money laundering, or counter financing of terrorism, CFT, the requirements are very broad, especially the requirements to monitor for and report suspicious activities. And it goes beyond just what you would think would be traditional money laundering or terrorist financing activities. It covers any illicit activities done by or through the RIA. So it's important to think broadly as you're thinking about those red flags that we were talking about before. And just as an example, FINRA had used these AML requirements in targeting illicit activity that they saw around penny stock fraud. And so, even though when you think of penny stock fraud, you're not thinking that's traditional money laundering, although there might be some money laundering that happens as a result of that, just the penny stock manipulation activity itself was considered illicit and should have been monitored for. And so it's an example of where these AML requirements go beyond just traditional money laundering and terrorist financing activities. So I would expect that other types of areas such as cyber incidents, generalized fraud, elder exploitation. Those are the types of things that, as you're thinking about your programs here, are things that you need to keep in mind in terms of things that you should be monitoring for. So again, like we said, it's a lot to digest. We've got some time ahead of us, but really appreciate the opportunity, Bryan, for you to share what those requirements are so that our clients can really start thinking about what they need to do between now and the end of the year. So really appreciate that, and look forward to talking to you more.
Great. Thank you.
If you found today's discussion helpful, don't forget to subscribe for more episodes where we dive into industry strategies and best practices. For more information about our experts and our services, visit our website at oysterllc.com. Thanks for listening.